The wind screaming across the Montana Rockies didn't sound like nature. It sounded like vengeance. Buried beneath 12 feet of packed snow, the temperature outside was 50 below zero, a whiteout that was burying the state alive. Up above, the Ravalli County search and rescue teams had long ago grounded their choppers, assuming anyone caught on the Sapphire Ridge was already a frozen corpse. But deep inside the hillside, completely invisible to the deadly blizzard howling above, a fire crackled warmly. Nora Hayes sat by the hearth of her earthen fortress, sipping pine needle tea. They had thrown her away to die. They were wrong. The rain in Darby, Montana, felt like ice water mixed with gravel as it lashed against the black umbrellas of the funeral attendees. Richard Hayes was being lowered into the muddy earth of St. Jude's Cemetery, taking with him the last shred of protection his daughter, Nora, had in the world. Nora stood at the edge of the grave, the cold seeping through the thin fabric of her black dress. She was 26, with hands calloused from years of working the family's 300-acre cattle ranch, Whispering Pines. Across the open grave stood her stepmother, Sylvia, shivering theatrically in a designer faux fur coat that cost more than a year's worth of cattle feed. Besides, Sylvia was her son, Liam, Nora's stepbrother, who spent more time checking his Rolex than looking at the mahogany casket. Richard's death had been sudden, a massive coronary out in the lower pastures. Nora had been the one to find him, face down in the frost-covered fescue. But even before the coroner had signed the certificate, the atmosphere in the ranch house had shifted. The subtle hostility Sylvia and Liam had harbored for years suddenly dropped its mask. The true betrayal unfolded 3 hours after the funeral. In the mahogany-paneled office of Caldwell and Finch, a prominent law firm in Missoula, Harrison Finch, a man with cold, watery eyes and a habit of clearing his throat before delivering bad news, slid a thick stack of stapled documents across the desk. As you know, Richard restructured the family trust 18 months ago, Finch began, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. Nora frowned. My father never mentioned a restructuring. He told me Whispering Pines was being left to me, just as it was left to him by my grandfather. Sylvia let out a soft, patronizing sigh, crossing her legs. Oh, Nora, sweetheart. Your father's mind was slipping. The debts were piling up. He knew you didn't have the business acumen to handle a multi-million-dollar operation. He named Sylvia the sole executor and primary beneficiary of the estate, including the ranch, the liquid assets, and the equipment. Finch stated flatly, tapping the paper. Everything is legally watertight, signed, notarized, and filed with the county clerk. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs. That's a lie. He wouldn't do that. Let me see the signature. She grabbed the document. The signature was her father's, or an incredibly perfect forgery. But the date was what caught her eye. It was signed during the 2 weeks Richard was heavily medicated on painkillers following a severe tractor accident. Sylvia had legally cornered a heavily sedated man. What about me? Nora asked, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a rising, white-hot fury. Richard did leave a provision for you, Finch said, sliding a much thinner, cheaper envelope across the polished wood. A parcel of land he acquired privately last year, Tract 42, up on the Sapphire Ridge. The deed is fully in your name. Liam snorted from the corner of the room. Have fun with that. It's a vertical rock slide. Not even the mountain goats want it. By the time Nora returned to Whispering Pines, the cruelty of her new reality was laid bare. As she pulled her battered 1998 Ford F-250 up to the wraparound porch, she saw her belongings, everything she owned, shoved into industrial black trash bags, sitting in the mud at the bottom of the steps. Liam was leaning against the porch railing, chewing on a toothpick. Mom wants you off the property before sundown. The locks are already changed. This is my home, Liam, Nora said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper as she stepped out of the truck. I was born in that house. I rebuilt the south barn with my own hands. It's private property now. Trespasser, Liam sneered, pulling out his cell phone. I've got Sheriff Boyd on speed dial. You want to spend the night in the county lockup, or do you want to take your trash and leave? Nora looked at the ranch. The rolling green pastures, the white fences, the towering pines that gave the place its name. It was gone. Stolen by a woman who hadn't worked a day in her life. Nora didn't scream. She didn't cry. She walked over to the trash bags, hoisted them into the bed of the F-250, and climbed back into the driver's seat. She rolled down the window, looking Liam dead in the eye. "You don't know the first thing about this land, Liam. It will eat you alive." With that, she threw the truck into gear, the tires spinning in the mud, and drove away from her legacy, heading toward the mountains, as the first bitter winds of late October began to howl. The drive up the Skalkaho Highway was a grueling ascent into isolation. The pastoral beauty of the Bitterroot Valley quickly gave way to the jagged, unforgiving wilderness of the Sapphire Mountains. The higher Nora drove, the colder the air became. The heater in her old F-250 rattled, blowing only lukewarm air against the chilling glass. Tract 42 wasn't on a paved road. It wasn't even on a designated logging road. According to the GPS coordinates scribbled on the deed, she had to turn off onto a forgotten fire break, a path overgrown with creeping juniper and scattered boulders. The truck's suspension groaned, bottoming out violently twice before she finally hit a dead end, boxed in by a dense wall of lodgepole pines. She killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was absolute, heavy, and terrifying. Nora stepped out of the truck. The air here was thin, sharp enough to bite the inside of her lungs. She looked up at her inheritance. Liam hadn't been exaggerating. Tract 42 was essentially a 45-degree slope of brutal, rocky hillside facing south. There was no flat ground. There was no cabin. There was no electricity, no well, and no cellular service. It was 40 acres of vertical wilderness. It was a death sentence. Sylvia and Liam knew exactly what they were doing. They had handed her an uninhabitable piece of rock right before the Montana winter set in, knowing she had less than $300 in her checking account. They expected her to crawl back to town, defeated, begging for a minimum wage job, completely out of their way. "Damn it, Dad," Nora whispered, her voice cracking as she stared at the looming, shadowed hill. "What were you thinking?" The first night was a brutal test of endurance. Nora slept in the cab of the truck, bundled in 2 sleeping bags, wearing 3 layers of clothing. Even so, the deep mountain cold seeped through the metal doors. By dawn, condensation had frozen solid on the inside of the windshield. She woke up shivering uncontrollably, her joints aching. She fired up a small camp stove on the tailgate to boil snow for coffee, wrapping her raw hands around the tin mug to absorb the heat. She had to take inventory. She had her father's heavy canvas tool bag, a chainsaw, an axe, a shovel, a rifle, and a heavy-duty winch mounted to the front of the truck. In her trash bags, she had heavy winter gear, boots, and a few boxes of dry pantry goods she had managed to snag before leaving: rice, dried beans, jerky, and canned soup. Enough food for maybe 3 weeks if she rationed strictly. The winter storms were, at most, a month away. Once the heavy snows began, the fire break would be impassable. She would be trapped. She needed shelter, but building a traditional log cabin by herself, on a steep incline in 4 weeks, was physically impossible. Seeking a distraction from her rising panic, Nora began digging through her father's heavy steel toolbox in the bed of the truck. She was looking for a heavier pair of work gloves when her fingers snagged on a false bottom beneath the wrench tray. She pried it up. Hidden beneath the metal partition was a thick, leather-bound journal, wrapped tightly in plastic to protect it from moisture. Nora recognized her father's scrawling handwriting on the cover. She took the journal to the cab and opened it. The pages were filled with detailed topographical maps, sun angle calculations, and architectural sketches. The maps were of Tract 42, August 14th. The first entry read, "Sylvia is moving money to offshore accounts. She thinks I don't see it. The medication makes me groggy, but I'm not blind. I can't break the new trust without a massive legal battle that will drain the ranch dry. I have to secure a fallback for Nora. The Sapphire Land is perfect, unreachable, unwanted, but it holds heat." Nora turned the page, her breath catching. Her father hadn't bought this land as a joke. He had planned an off-grid survival sanctuary, The sketches detailed a walapini, an earth-sheltered structure dug directly into the hillside. "The earth is a battery," her father had written. "Below the frost line, the soil in this ridge stays at a constant 52 degrees year-round. Don't build on top of the mountain, Nora. The wind will tear it apart. Build inside the mountain. Let the earth swallow the cold." He had mapped out the exact coordinates on the south-facing slope where the sun would hit the hill all winter long. He had calculated the timber load for the roof. He had even drawn schematics for a rocket mass heater, a highly efficient stove that could heat tons of earth and stone using only twigs and small branches. Tears finally spilled over Nora's cheeks, freezing almost instantly in the frigid air. Her father hadn't abandoned her. He had given her a blueprint to survive the apocalypse her stepmother had orchestrated. Nora wiped her eyes, leaving streaks of dirt across her pale skin. She looked out the window at the intimidating hillside. It wasn't a death sentence anymore. It was a fortress, waiting to be carved. She grabbed her heavy leather gloves and a pickaxe. It was time to dig. The physical reality of carving a home into a mountain is a brutal, agonizing mathematics of calorie expenditure versus progress. The Montana soil was hostile, a stubborn matrix of compacted clay, jagged shale, and interwoven roots of ancient pines. Nora began at the exact GPS coordinate her father had marked, a slight indentation on the south-facing slope, sheltered by a natural overhang of granite. Her plan was to dig straight back into the hill, creating a rectangular dugout 12 feet wide and 15 feet deep. The back and side walls would be pure earth, acting as massive thermal regulators. Only the front face and the roof would need to be framed with timber and insulated. For the first 3 days, the progress was excruciatingly slow. Nora swung the heavy pickaxe until her shoulders screamed and her palms tore open, bleeding into her leather gloves. She used a heavy iron mattock to loosen the dirt, then shoveled it into a wheelbarrow, dumping it further down the slope to create a flat terrace for the eventual front door. Every night, she collapsed into the freezing cab of the truck, her muscles seizing, consuming only a meager bowl of rice and beans to stretch her rations. She was losing weight rapidly. The dark circles under her eyes bruised a deep purple. On the 4th afternoon, the sky turned a bruised, metallic gray. The temperature plummeted 15 degrees in a single hour. The first warning shot of winter, desperation fueled her swings. She was hacking at a massive, stubborn root system of a dead lodgepole pine that was blocking her excavation of the back wall. The pickaxe kept bouncing off the thick, petrified wood. Frustrated, Nora threw the pickaxe down and unspooled the heavy steel cable from the F-250's front winch. She dragged the heavy iron hook up the slope, wrapping a thick tow strap around the base of the dead stump, and hooked it in. She retreated to the truck, started the engine, and engaged the winch. The steel cable snapped taut, humming like a giant guitar string. The truck's suspension groaned, the front tires digging into the dirt. Up on the hill, the stump resisted, then violently popped, the earth tearing open with a loud, sucking crunch. Nora stopped the winch and climbed back up the slope. As the dust settled, she froze. The stump hadn't just pulled out roots. It had ripped away a massive false wall of packed debris and timber. Where the dead tree had been, there was now a gaping black hole leading straight into the hillside. A rush of stale, metallic-smelling air drifted out from the darkness. Nora grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight from her tool bag and clicked it on, shining the beam into the void. It wasn't a cave. It was man-made. The walls were shored up with ancient, blackened timber. It was an old prospecting adit, a horizontal tunnel dug by silver miners in the late 1800s, long abandoned and hidden by decades of landslides and overgrowth. Her father hadn't just picked this spot for the solar angle. He had found this tunnel. The indentation in the hill wasn't natural. It was the collapsed entrance of the mine. Nora stepped cautiously inside. The tunnel went back about 20 feet before ending in a solid wall of granite. It was roughly 10 feet wide and 8 feet tall. The floor was surprisingly level, covered in decades of dry dust. But the most important thing Nora noticed instantly was the temperature. Outside, the wind chill was dropping into the 20s. Inside the tunnel, stepping past the frost line, the air felt remarkably warm, hovering comfortably in the low 50s. She had just been gifted weeks of grueling excavation. The mountain had already been hollowed out, but it was dangerous. The old timber supports were bowing, groaning softly as the mountain settled around them. If she lit a fire or disturbed the wrong load-bearing rock, the ceiling could cave in and bury her alive. She needed to reinforce the structure immediately before the heavy snowpack added tons of weight to the roof above. The next week became a frantic race against the sky. Nora turned into a lumberjack. She used her chainsaw to fell dozens of straight, healthy lodgepole pines on her property. She dragged the heavy logs to the site using the truck, stripped them of their bark with a draw knife to prevent rot, and began the brutal work of framing the interior of the cavern. She built massive post and beam supports, lifting 300-pound logs using an ingenious system of ropes, pulleys, and the truck's winch. She wedged them tight against the stone ceiling, creating a cage of fresh, strong timber inside the crumbling rock. Once the interior was stabilized, she set to work on the front face. She built a thick, double-walled timber frame across the gaping mouth of the cave, leaving spaces for a heavy door and a salvaged glass window she had found, buried under a tarp in the truck bed, another gift from her father. She packed the space between the double timber walls with dry earth and pine needles for extreme insulation. As November arrived, the first real blizzard struck. It didn't flurry, it dumped. The wind howled through the Sapphire Ridge like a chorus of screaming wolves, burying the access road under 3 feet of powder in a matter of hours. The truck was useless now, buried up to its axles. She was entirely cut off from the world. Inside the hillside, the darkness was absolute. Nora had sealed the front wall, hanging heavy wool blankets over the doorframe to keep out the drafts. But it was still getting cold. The ambient earth temperature of 50 degrees wasn't enough to survive the sub-zero plunges that were coming. She needed fire. By the dim light of a kerosene lantern, Nora worked frantically on the final piece of her father's blueprint, the rocket mass heater. She had salvaged a 50-gallon steel drum, lengths of heavy stovepipe, and a massive pile of river rocks and clay she had dug from a nearby dried creek bed before the freeze. She built the burn chamber using fire bricks her father had stashed in the toolboxes, designing it so the fire burned sideways, drawing oxygen in with a fierce draft. The exhaust piped through a long, winding horizontal channel, covered in tons of clay and stone, her thermal battery. Her hands were shaking from the biting cold as she struck a match and dropped it onto a small pile of dried lichen and pine twigs inside the burn chamber. The flame flickered, then caught. The sideways draft kicked in, and the fire let out a low, jet engine roar, the signature sound of a rocket stove. Nora sat back on her heels, watching as the flames shot backward into the heating chamber. The metal drum heated up instantly, radiating intense warmth. But the real magic happened over the next few hours. The hot exhaust gases traveled through the clay bench she had built, transferring their heat into the massive stone and earth structure, before venting out the chimney pipe, a mere trickle of white steam. By midnight, the blizzard outside was tearing at the mountain, dropping temperatures to 20 below. But inside the dugout, sitting on the heated clay bench, Nora unzipped her heavy winter coat. It was 70 degrees. The thermal mass was holding the heat perfectly, radiating it back into the room like a giant, gentle radiator. She leaned her head against the rough timber wall, closing her eyes. She was exhausted, starving, and entirely alone in a frozen wasteland. But she was warm. She was alive. Sylvia and Liam thought they had buried her. They didn't realize they had just given her a mountain. But as Nora drifted into an exhausted sleep, she didn't know that the smoke venting from her hidden chimney had just been spotted by someone else on the ridge, someone who wasn't supposed to be there. For 3 days, the blizzard battered the Sapphire Ridge with the force of a freight train. Inside her earthen fortress, Nora lived in a strange, suspended reality. The rocket mass heater performed a daily miracle, turning a few handfuls of scavenged pine branches into a steady, radiant heat that kept the dugout at a comfortable 65 degrees. She passed the hours reading her father's journal, patching her worn clothes, and mapping out the labyrinth of the old Blackwood mine with a charcoal pencil on the back of an old receipt. She was surviving, but the isolation was beginning to press against her skull like a physical weight. On the 4th night, the wind suddenly changed pitch. It dropped from a shrieking howl to a low, rhythmic thumping. Nora sat up on her bedroll, her heart hammering in her throat. The thumping wasn't the wind. It was coming from the heavy timber door at the mouth of the tunnel. Thud. 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 It was weak, erratic, and utterly terrifying. Bears were already hibernating, and a mountain lion wouldn't knock. Nora threw off her wool blankets. The ambient light of the fire cast long, dancing shadows across the granite walls. She moved silently to the corner, where she kept her father's Winchester, 30-30 rifle. She racked the lever, the metallic clack echoing sharply in the cavern, and chambered around. She pressed her ear against the freezing timber of the door. "Help!" A voice rasped from the other side. It was barely a whisper, shredded by the wind. "Please! I see the smoke." Nora's grip on the rifle tightened. Opening the door during a whiteout was a massive risk. It could be a trap. It could be one of Liam's friends, sent up here on a snowmobile to finish the job. But the sheer desperation in the voice clawed at her conscience. If she left them out there, they would be a frozen corpse by morning. She undid the heavy iron latch and cracked the door open just an inch, keeping her shoulder braced against it to fight the violent backdraft of the storm. A body instantly collapsed against the timber, forcing the door open. A rush of blinding white snow and agonizingly cold air flooded the tunnel. Nora shoved the door shut against the gale, throwing the deadbolt. She spun around, leveling the Winchester. Lying face down on the dirt floor was a man. He was covered in a thick layer of ice and snow, wearing a shredded canvas parka that looked like it had been dragged through a briar patch. He wasn't moving. Keeping the rifle trained on him, Nora approached cautiously. She used her boot to roll him onto his back. He was a stranger, perhaps in his late 40s, with a thick, ice-caked beard and a face completely devoid of color. His lips were a terrifying shade of blue. He wasn't wearing snowmobile gear. He looked like a backcountry trapper who had lost a war with the mountain. He was dying. Survival instincts, honed by years of nursing sick calves during the harsh Montana calving season, kicked in. Nora set the rifle down. She grabbed him by the collar of his parka and used all her leverage to drag his dead weight closer to the radiant heat of the clay bench. "Hey! Wake up," she ordered, slapping his frozen cheek. His skin felt like marble. She worked frantically to strip off his outer layers. His gloves were frozen solid to his hands. When she finally pried them off, she winced. His fingers were stark white, the early stages of severe frostbite. She knew better than to rub them or put them directly near the fire. Rapid thawing would destroy the cellular tissue. Instead, she filled a metal basin with lukewarm water from her snowmelt bucket and submerged his hands. She wrapped him in her own heavy wool blankets and forced a few drops of warm, sugary pine needle tea between his cracked lips. It took 2 agonizing hours before his body began to violently shudder. The shivering was a good sign. His core temperature was rising. His eyes fluttered open. They were a pale, striking gray, wide with disorientation. He looked at the heavy timber ceiling, then at the crackling fire, and finally at Nora, who was sitting 6 feet away, the Winchester resting across her knees. "You're in my home," Nora said, her voice steady, betraying none of the panic she felt. "Give me one good reason why I shouldn't throw you back out into the snow." The man coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "Because," he wheezed, his voice like grinding stones, "if you throw me out, I can't tell you who's coming up the mountain to kill you." His name was Garrett Cole. He wasn't a fugitive, and he wasn't a poacher. He was an off-grid surveyor who had been living deep in the Sapphire Range for the better part of a decade. He knew these mountains better than the wolves did. By the second day, Garrett had recovered enough to sit up and eat a small bowl of Nora's rapidly dwindling rice and beans. The frostbite on his hands had blistered terribly, leaving him temporarily crippled, which gave Nora a margin of safety. He couldn't hold a weapon even if he wanted to. "I didn't expect anyone to be up here," Garrett admitted, blowing on his hot tea. He looked around the reinforced cavern with a critical, approving eye, especially not a woman carving out a wallapini inside the old Blackwood adit. "You've got grit, kid. I'll give you that." "You said someone was coming to kill me," Nora demanded, ignoring the compliment. She sat across from him, cleaning the action of the rifle with a rag. "Explain." Garrett sighed, leaning back against the clay wall. 3 days ago, before the whiteout hit, I was tracking a herd of elk down near the lower logging roads. I saw a crew of men setting up a staging camp at the base of Tract 42. They weren't hunters. They had heavy machinery, core drills, seismic thumpers. Nora frowned. "On a vertical rock slide?" "Why?" "Because of what's under the rock slide," Garrett said softly. He pointed a bandaged finger toward the dark, unexcavated rear of the tunnel. "You think this is just an abandoned silver claim? Silver dried up here in 1898. But the geology of the Sapphire Ridge is a geological freak show. It's a massive, intrusive igneous formation." "Speak plain English, Garrett." "Rare earth elements," he said, holding her gaze. "Neodymium, praseodymium, the stuff they need to build microchips, electric car batteries, and military guidance systems. There's a global shortage. Last summer, a massive conglomerate quietly ran aerial magnetic surveys over the Bitterroot Valley. Tract 42 lit up like a Christmas tree. This useless piece of rock you're sitting on is sitting on top of one of the richest untapped rare earth deposits in North America. It's worth hundreds of millions. The pieces fell into place with a sickening, heavy thud in Nora's mind. Sylvia didn't know. Her father had known. Richard Hayes had found out about the aerial surveys. He knew the ranch was failing, drowning in debt, and that Sylvia would bleed it dry the moment he died. He bought Tract 42 privately, quietly, and deeded it strictly to Nora. He didn't just give her a survival bunker. He gave her the ultimate trump card. "The men at the base of the mountain," Nora said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Who are they?" "Corporate fixers. Land acquisition thugs," Garrett replied. "They usually wait until spring to pressure holdouts. But they seem desperate. Someone tipped them off that the owner of Tract 42 was up here, alone, and vulnerable. They were prepping a modified snowcat to make the climb before the storm grounded them." Liam had found out. Perhaps he found a letter from the conglomerate in Richard's private files after Nora left. He realized they had given away the golden goose, and Liam wasn't the type to call a lawyer when a bullet would be cheaper and faster. If Nora died up here in an unfortunate winter accident, the land would revert to her next of kin, her father's estate, controlled entirely by Sylvia. "The storm bought you time," Garrett said, breaking her dark train of thought. "The snowcat can't make it up the fire break in 6 feet of fresh powder. But the snow will settle. The freeze will harden the crust. In a week, maybe 2, they'll come up that ridge." Nora stood up, walking to the heavy timber door. She pulled back the wool blanket slightly, looking out through the small pane of salvaged glass. The blizzard was finally breaking. The wind had died down, leaving behind a terrifyingly silent, pristine white world. "Then we have 2 weeks to prepare," Nora said. "We?" Garrett let out a dry, hacking laugh. "Look at my hands, kid. I can't even strike a match. I'm dead weight. You have the knowledge. I have the hands." Nora turned back to him, her eyes hardening into something cold and sharp. The frightened girl who had cried in her truck a month ago was gone, burned away by the harsh reality of the mountain. "My stepbrother threw me away to die. He's coming up here to finish the job. I'm not going to be a victim in my own home." Garrett studied her for a long moment, the amusement fading from his face. He saw the grim determination in the set of her jaw. "All right," Garrett said slowly. "If we're going to hold this hill against armed men, we need to turn this terrain into a nightmare. But first, we have a more immediate problem." "What's that?" "Food." Garrett pointed to the empty burlap sack in the corner. "You've been feeding me your winter rations. You have exactly 1 day's worth of calories left. If we don't hunt, we'll starve long before the snowcat reaches us." He was right. The adrenaline of the revelation had masked the deep, gnawing ache in her stomach. The mountain was a merciless ledger. Every action cost calories, and her account was entirely overdrawn. "The snow is chest-deep out there," Nora said. "We can't walk in it." "We aren't going to walk," Garrett said, gesturing to a pile of flexible willow saplings Nora had cut weeks ago for kindling. "We're going to weave. Grab your paracord. I'm going to teach you how to make bear paw snowshoes. And then, I'm going to teach you how to track a mule deer through a frozen hell." The willow branches were still green enough beneath their frozen bark to bend without snapping. Sitting by the radiant warmth of the clay heating bench, Garrett verbally guided Nora through the meticulous process of weaving the snowshoes. His own hands, swathed in strips of cotton torn from a spare shirt, rested uselessly in his lap. "Keep the paracord tight," Garrett instructed, his voice raspy but authoritative. "If the webbing is loose, the snow will pack through, and you'll be dragging 10 pounds of ice on each foot. You want to float on the crust, not punch through it." Nora pulled the neon green military cord taut, her fingers aching from the repetitive motion. She tied off the final half-hitch and held up the makeshift teardrop-shaped frames. They were crude, ugly things, but as she strapped her heavy leather winter boots into the center bindings, they felt incredibly solid. "All right," Nora said, grabbing her father's Winchester. 30 to 30 and a skinning knife. "Which way?" "Mule deer will yard up during a heavy blow," Garrett said, leaning his head back and closing his eyes to visualize the topography. "They look for deep thermal cover. Hemlock or thick cedar stands on south-facing slopes. There's a heavy timber draw about a half-mile east of here, just below the tree line. Keep the wind in your face. If you shoot, don't rush the tracking. Let them bleed out, or they'll run for miles on adrenaline, and you'll never catch them." Stepping out of the Wallapini was like stepping onto the surface of an alien planet. The blizzard had wiped the world clean. The jagged rocks, the creeping juniper, the stumps of the trees she had felled. Everything was buried beneath an undulating ocean of blinding white powder. Nora tested the snowshoes. She took a tentative step. The webbing held, distributing her weight over the icy crust that had formed overnight. She didn't sink. The air was so cold it felt like inhaling broken glass. She moved east, adopting a wide, rolling gait to keep the snowshoes from clipping each other. The silence of the mountain was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic crunch squeak of her steps. It took her an hour of grueling exertion to reach the timber draw Garrett had described. The trees here were ancient, their massive, snow-laden branches interlocking to form a dense canopy that caught the worst of the snowfall. Leaving the ground beneath relatively clear, she found the tracks almost immediately. Deep, distinct, heart-shaped indentations in the shallower snow. A small herd. Nora checked the wind by tossing a pinch of dry snow into the air. It blew back against her cheek. Perfect. She unslung the Winchester, her thumb resting on the cold steel of the hammer, and moved into the shadows of the cedars. She stalked for another 30 minutes, moving slower than she ever had in her life. Every snapped twig sounded like a gunshot in the dead air. Finally, through a break in the heavy green boughs, she saw them. 3 does and a young buck, huddled together, stripping the bark off a fallen sapling. Her stomach gave a violent, painful hollow throb at the sight of the meat. Nora raised the rifle, settling the wooden stock against her shoulder. She exhaled slowly, letting the white plume of her breath dissipate, and aligned the iron sights behind the buck's front shoulder. She squeezed the trigger. The roar of the 30 to 30 shattered the stillness of the mountain. The herd exploded into motion, vanishing into the trees in a flurry of kicked-up snow. But the buck stumbled. It took 3 desperate bounds before its front legs buckled, plunging headfirst into a deep drift. Nora didn't cheer. There was no joy in it, only the grim satisfaction of a biological imperative fulfilled. The real nightmare began after the kill. Field dressing a 150-pound animal in sub-zero temperatures was a race against the freezing of flesh and blood. She worked barehanded, her hands slick with steaming blood that began to freeze into a tacky crimson glue the moment it touched the air. By the time she had quartered the meat and lashed the heavy haunches to a makeshift sled, fashioned from pine boughs and paracord, the sun was dipping below the sapphire ridge, casting long, bruised shadows across the snow. The drag back to the dugout took 3 times as long as the hike out. Her muscles burned with lactic acid, her lungs searing with every breath. But as she finally hauled the bloody sled up to the heavy timber door and dragged it inside, the smell of the raw meat seemed to fill the room with life. Garrett opened his eyes, looking at the steaming cuts of venison. A slow, exhausted smile spread across his cracked lips. "You did it, kid." "We eat tonight," Nora gasped, collapsing onto the dirt floor beside the fire. "And tomorrow, we get ready for war." The venison stew, thickened with the last of their dried beans, tasted better than any meal Nora had ever eaten at Whispering Pines. The influx of rich, dense protein fueled a rapid recovery for both of them. Within 3 days, Garrett's hands had stopped blistering, though the skin remained angry and raw. Wrapped securely in fresh bandages, he still couldn't fire a rifle, but he could hold a pencil. And Garrett Cole was an artist with a pencil. He sat at the small wooden crate they used as a table, sketching a detailed topographical map of the firebreak that led up to Tract 42. "A snowcat is a beast," Garrett explained, tracing a dark line up the center of the paper. "It has wide tracks, low ground pressure. It can climb a 45-degree grade in deep snow without breaking a sweat. But it has a fatal flaw." "Which is?" Nora asked, feeding another thick branch into the rocket heater. "It's wide, and it's clumsy in tight spaces." Garrett tapped the pencil on a narrow bottleneck on the map. "Right here. About 300 yards below us. The fire break runs between a sheer rock wall on the left and a steep ravine on the right. It's barely 12 feet wide. If they want to get to this elevation, they have to drive through that chute." "So we block it," Nora suggested. "Fell some trees across the path." Garrett shook his head. "A corporate crew in a snowcat will have a hydraulic winch and chainsaws. A deadfall will slow them down by maybe 20 minutes. We don't want to slow them down, Nora. We want to stop them permanently. We need to trap the machine." He flipped the paper over and began drawing a mechanical schematic. "You said your F-250 has a heavy-duty worn winch on the front bumper. 12,000-pound capacity?" "Yeah. My dad installed it for pulling stumps and dragging tractors out of the mud." "Perfect. And you have the steel towing cables from the mine?" Nora nodded. While Garrett had been recovering, she had spent a day exploring the deeper recesses of the Blackwood adit. Behind a collapsed pile of shale, she had found a rusted but intact spool of braided steel cable, thick as a man's thumb, used a century ago for hauling ore carts. "We are going to build a tension snare," Garrett said, his pale gray eyes gleaming in the firelight. "A steel web." For the next week, the mountain became their workshop. The weather held, remaining brutally cold but clear. Working under Garrett's exact verbal instructions, Nora hauled her gear down to the bottleneck. The work was terrifyingly dangerous. The snow here was treacherous, hiding deep fissures in the rock. Following Garrett's blueprint, Nora took the heavy steel mining cable and wove it back and forth across the narrow chute, anchoring it to 3 massive, old-growth ponderosa pines on either side of the trail. But she didn't just tie them off. She ran the cables low, burying them just beneath the surface of the packed snow, stringing them at angles designed to catch the heavy treads of a tracked vehicle. The master stroke was the winch. Nora had to dig through 6 feet of snow to reach her buried truck, detaching the winch motor and heavy battery. She hauled the massive iron assembly down the mountain on her sled and bolted it to a granite outcropping directly above the bottleneck, hidden by a cluster of creeping junipers. She connected the loose ends of the steel web to the winch's hook. "When they drive into the chute," Garrett had explained, "their tracks will roll over the slack cables, hidden in the snow. The moment their center of gravity is over the web, you hit the winch remote. The cables will snap taut, lifting straight up under the undercarriage. It will rip the tracks right off the bogies and bind the drive sprockets. They'll be paralyzed in a steel cage." On the morning of the 12th day since the blizzard ended, the trap was finally set. Nora sat on the ridge above the bottleneck, wrapped in a white wool blanket for camouflage, her finger resting on the wired remote for the winch. The Winchester lay across her lap. Garrett was back at the dugout, keeping the fire alive. He had insisted she take the rifle. "If the trap fails, Nora, you don't run back here. You shoot the engine block and run for the high ridge." The sun crested the peaks, turning the snowfields into a blinding expanse of diamonds. Then, she heard it. It started as a low, mechanical growl, echoing up from the Bitterroot Valley. It grew steadily louder, a deep, rhythmic, diesel thumping that vibrated through the frozen earth. Nora peered through her binoculars. A mile below, rounding the bend of the lower logging road, a massive, bright orange machine chewed its way through the snowdrifts. It was a customized Prenoth snowcat, its heavy front blade pushing aside walls of white powder like they were nothing. Riding in the enclosed, heated cab were 3 men. 2 of them were large, wearing dark, tactical winter gear the corporate fixers Garrett had warned her about. But it was the man in the passenger seat that made Nora's blood run cold. Even through the glare of the windshield, she recognized the expensive sunglasses and the arrogant tilt of his head. It was Liam. He hadn't just sent men to kill her. He had come up to watch it happen, likely to ensure there were no mistakes so he could claim the rare earth bounty for himself. Nora's grip tightened on the winch remote. Her breath came in shallow, frosty plumes. They were a half-mile out. Then, a quarter-mile. The roar of the diesel engine was deafening now, drowning out the wind. "Come on," Nora whispered to the wind. "Come and take my land." The snowcat ground its way up the incline, turning its massive, steel-cleated tracks directly into the narrow jaws of the bottleneck chute. The Prenoth snowcat was a marvel of modern alpine engineering, but it was deaf and blind to the mountain's true nature. Inside the heated, sound-dampened cab, Liam and the 2 corporate fixers, heavy-set men named Briggs and Cutler, were completely oblivious to the trap laid beneath their churning tracks. Nora watched through the scope of the Winchester, her breathing slow and measured, just as her father had taught her when they hunted elk in the bitter cold. The snowcat lumbered into the bottleneck, the massive front blade scraping against the granite walls of the chute. "Wait," Garrett's voice echoed in her memory. "Let them commit. Let the center of gravity pass the midline." The vehicle crept forward. 10 feet, 15 feet. It was directly over the buried mining cables. Nora slammed her thumb down on the wired worn winch remote. 100 yards below, the heavy-duty electric winch, bolted securely to the granite outcropping, screamed to life. The slack in the century-old braided steel cables vanished in a microsecond. The snow beneath the snowcat erupted. The thick steel cables snapped upward with tens of thousands of pounds of kinetic tension, catching the underside of the heavy rubber and steel tracks. The sheer force of the winch, combined with the forward momentum of the machine, created a catastrophic mechanical failure. The cables bit into the drive sprockets, binding them instantly. A horrific screech of tearing metal echoed up the canyon. The snowcat violently bucked, its rear end lifting 3 feet into the air. The heavy, cleated tracks were ripped entirely off the bogies, unspooling like massive, broken watch springs. The engine roared in a desperate, red-lined panic before stalling out with a sickening, grinding clunk. The machine slammed back down into the snow, paralyzed, tilted at a severe 30-degree angle, wedged against the rock wall. Nora didn't hesitate. Shoot the engine block. She adjusted her aim, settling the crosshairs of the 30-30 on the heavy steel grill of the snowcat. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder. The crack of the gunshot rolled like thunder across the ridge. A second shot. A third. The heavy, flat-nosed hunting rounds punched cleanly through the grill and into the engine compartment. On the third shot, a thick geyser of black oil and white, hissing steam erupted from the front of the machine. The radiator was dead. The block was cracked. The heated cab would be an icebox in less than 20 minutes. Down in the chute, the doors of the disabled snowcat flew open. Briggs and Cutler spilled out into the waist-deep snow, moving with the chaotic urgency of men who had just realized they were prey. Both were armed with semi-automatic rifles, but the deep powder instantly neutralized their tactical advantage. They sank to their thighs, floundering helplessly as they tried to find cover behind the crippled vehicle. Liam tumbled out last, wearing a designer ski jacket that was utterly useless against the biting Montana wind. He landed face first in a snowdrift, shrieking in panic. "Sniper! Up on the ridge!" Briggs bellowed, pointing blindly toward the tree line where Nora was concealed. He raised his rifle and unleashed a volley of suppressive fire. Bullets chewed into the pine branches 30 feet above Nora's head, showering her with needles and snow. Nora pressed herself flat against the frozen earth, the white wool blanket making her virtually invisible against the terrain. She didn't return fire. She had the high ground, the snowshoes, and the patience of the mountain. "Call for backup," Cutler yelled, fumbling for a satellite phone clipped to his tactical vest. He pulled it free, frantically dialing. Nora chambered another round. She couldn't let them call in a heavily armed corporate extraction team. She took a deep breath, visualizing the trajectory, and fired. The bullet didn't hit Cutler. It wasn't meant to. It struck the reinforced glass of the snowcat's side window, mere inches from his head, showering him in jagged safety glass. Cutler flinched violently, dropping the satellite phone into the bottomless, churning powder at his feet. "My phone! It's gone!" Cutler screamed, digging frantically in the snow with frostbitten fingers. "Leave it! We have to push up the ridge," Briggs commanded, trying to wade through the snow. But without snowshoes, the 45-degree incline was an impossible fortress. Every step he took forward resulted in him sliding 2 steps back, burning massive amounts of calories in the sub-zero air. Liam was huddled behind the rear treads, hyperventilating, his face pale with terror. "We're going to die out here. You said this was a milk run. You said she was just a dumb ranch girl." Nora watched them struggle. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a cold, calculating calm. She backed away from the ledge, utilizing her bare-paw snowshoes to glide silently across the crust of the snow, repositioning herself further down the ridge to flank them. The sun was beginning to set, and with it, the temperature was plummeting rapidly. The wind picked up, a biting cross breeze that whipped the loose powder into a blinding ground blizzard. The mountain was stepping in to finish the fight. By nightfall, the ambient temperature in the chute had plummeted past 12 below zero, driven even lower by a vicious, biting wind chill that whipped down from the higher peaks. The mountain was no longer merely a landscape. It was an active, hostile predator, and its jaws were closing rapidly on the 3 men trapped in the bottleneck. Nora sat motionless on a rocky outcropping 50 yards above the disabled snowcat, a phantom cloaked in her white wool blanket. The deep, aching cold gnawed at her extremities, but she managed it. She had dug a tiny, smokeless Dakota fire hole behind a granite boulder, feeding it dry twigs one by one to keep her fingers nimble enough to operate the lever of the Winchester. She had the high ground, the snowshoes, and a lifetime of understanding exactly how quickly the Montana winter could kill a man. Down below, the situation had deteriorated from a tactical failure into a desperate fight for basic biological survival. The Prenoth snowcat, a $500,000 piece of alpine machinery, was now nothing more than a freezing iron tomb. The engine block had cracked completely, leaking a frozen sludge of oil and coolant into the snow. Through her binoculars, illuminated by the harsh, pale light of a rising crescent moon, Nora watched the 2 corporate fixers realize their fatal error. Briggs and Cutler were hard men, ex-military by the look of their movements, but they were urban operators. Their black tactical winter gear was designed for high-mobility urban raids, not for sustaining core body temperatures in a deep wilderness freeze. The moisture from their sweat during the initial panic had already frozen against their skin, accelerating the onset of hypothermia. Cutler was desperately trying to spark a magnesium road flare to ignite the ripped foam padding from the snowcat's seats. The flare hissed and sparked brilliantly in the dark, casting harsh red shadows against the canyon walls, but the hurricane-force gusts ripping through the chute snuffed it out every time the flame tried to catch the upholstery. The diesel fuel in the machine's tanks had long since turned into a useless, cloudy gel. Huddled in the deepest drift behind the vehicle's torn treads was Liam. He was weeping openly, a pathetic, gasping sound that carried up the ridge on the wind. His expensive designer ski jacket, meant for the heated lodges of Aspen, was a thin nylon shell, offering zero protection against the ambient air. His teeth were chattering so violently that Nora could hear the rhythmic clicking echoing off the rocks. "Hey!" Nora finally called out, her voice slicing through the freezing darkness. Because of the acoustic shape of the rocky chute, her voice seemed to boom from everywhere at once, disembodied and terrifying. Down in the snow, the 3 men froze. Briggs reacted on pure instinct, raising his rifle and aiming blindly into the blackness, his hands shaking so badly the barrel bobbed erratically. "Shoot at me again, and I'll put a hollow-point bullet right through the snowcat's auxiliary fuel tank," Nora warned. Her tone was completely flat, stripped of all empathy. She sounded exactly like the mountain itself. Cold, hard, and indifferent to their suffering. You'll be covered in frozen diesel, and you'll freeze to death in 10 minutes instead of 2 hours. Briggs hesitated, his finger hovering over the trigger guard. Another violent shiver racked his massive frame, forcing him to lower the weapon. He couldn't feel his fingers anymore. The cold was breaking his mind. "Nora!" Liam screamed, his voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical pitch. He scrambled uselessly in the chest-deep powder, trying to stand, but only sank deeper. "Nora, please!" "It's me, your brother." "Stepbrother," Nora corrected, the word tasting like metallic ash in her mouth. "And brothers don't forge wills, steal a century-old family ranch, and send corporate hitmen into a blizzard to freeze their sisters to death." "I didn't! I swear to God, I didn't!" Liam sobbed, the sheer terror of his impending death stripping away years of arrogant entitlement in seconds. He threw his stepmother under the bus with breathtaking speed. "Mom did it." Sylvia arranged all the paperwork with Finch. "She paid off the notary. I just wanted the mineral rights to the ridge. I didn't want you dead. Please, Nora, I can't feel my legs. My feet are gone. Let us into your cabin." "There is no cabin, Liam," Nora said smoothly, letting the silence hang heavily after her words. "Just the mountain." "What do you want?" Cutler yelled, his tough guy facade completely shattered. He dropped the useless, burned-out road flare into the snow. "We surrender, all right? You win. Just get us out of this wind. We'll sign whatever you want. Throw your weapons out into the snow, far away from the vehicle. Toss the spare magazines, too," Nora commanded. She watched through the starlight as Briggs hesitated for one final, agonizing second. Then, defeated by the absolute certainty of the cold, he unslung his heavy tactical rifle and hurled it into a deep snowdrift 20 feet away. Cutler immediately followed suit, tossing his sidearm and rifle into the powder where they vanished from sight. "Now," Nora said, her voice echoing with the absolute authority of the ridge. "In my father's F-250, buried at the bottom of the fire break, about 2 miles down from your current position, there is an emergency CB radio hardwired to the truck's battery. I want you to walk down there. You will tune it to Channel 9 and call Sheriff Boyd on the emergency frequency. You, Liam, are going to confess to the forged trust, the stolen ranch, and the corporate espionage. You are going to tell him exactly what Sylvia did on a recorded police frequency." "I can't walk down there," Liam cried, his voice dropping to a terrified, breathy wheeze. "It's 2 miles in deep snow. I'll die. We won't make it." "You're wearing $400 insulated boots, Liam. Figure it out," Nora replied coldly. "Start walking, or sit there and become a block of ice by midnight. It's your choice." "She's right," Briggs muttered, his voice slurring heavily, a highly dangerous neurological sign that his core temperature was dropping to critical, fatal levels. He grabbed Liam by the collar of his designer jacket and hauled him roughly to his feet. "We keep moving, generate body heat, or we die right here." Nora watched from the shadows as the 3 men, broken, shivering, and stripped of all their power, began the agonizing, chest-deep trudge back down the mountain. They were moving away from her land, defeated not by bullets or explosive violence, but by the brutal, unforgiving reality of the wilderness they thought they could easily conquer with machinery and money. She possessed the patience of a hunter. She waited for a full hour, tracking their slow, miserable progress until they were a mile down the trail, nothing more than dark specks struggling in the white expanse. Only then did she step into her bare-paw snowshoes and descend to the crippled snowcat. The machine smelled of hot ozone, spilled oil, and ozone. She moved efficiently, knowing the cold was starting to seep through her own layers. She salvaged what she needed: a comprehensive trauma first aid kit bolted to the roll cage, a stash of military-grade emergency MREs from the storage compartment, and 3 heavy, foil-lined Mylar thermal blankets. She looked at the destroyed, $500,000 machine, a frozen monument to corporate hubris, and then turned her snowshoes back toward the hidden Blackwood adit. The trek back was grueling, her muscles burning with lactic acid, but the adrenaline of her victory pushed her forward. When she finally reached the hillside and pushed open the heavy timber door of the Walapini, the blast of 70-degree air hit her face like a physical embrace, smelling of wood smoke and rich earth. The rocket mass heater was glowing softly, casting a warm, flickering golden light across the earthen walls and the massive timber supports. Garrett was sitting up on the clay bench. A crude, hand-drawn map of the ridge spread across his lap. He looked up as the heavy door thudded shut behind her, seeing the utter exhaustion, but also the quiet, undeniable victory burning in Nora's eyes. "They're gone," Nora said quietly, shedding her snowy outer layers and letting them drop to the dirt floor. She placed the salvaged MREs and the trauma kit on the wooden crate. "They're walking back to town to confess to the sheriff." Garrett let out a low, impressed whistle, a genuine smile finally breaking through his thick, grizzled beard. "I told you, kid. This land will provide exactly what you need, if you know how to ask." Nora walked over to the heating bench, sinking down onto the warm clay and letting the incredible thermal mass soothe her chilled bones. She pulled her father's leather-bound journal from her coat pocket, tracing the worn, familiar cover with her thumb. He hadn't just given her a piece of useless land. He had given her a crucible. The fire and the ice had burned away the frightened, helpless girl who had been kicked off her family ranch, leaving behind something forged from steel, timber, and stone. Nora Hayes never returned to Whispering Pines. Though Liam's frostbitten confession to Sheriff Boyd resulted in Sylvia's arrest and the unraveling of the forged trust, the sprawling pastoral ranch no longer felt like home. The real legacy her father had left her was buried high in the Sapphire Ridge. With the multi-million-dollar lease she eventually negotiated for the rare earth mineral rights on her own strict environmental terms, Nora had more wealth than she could ever spend. Yet, she remained on Tract 42. Beside Garrett, who became her trusted partner and mentor, she expanded the Walapini into a sprawling, off-grid marvel, perfectly synced with the harsh Montana seasons. When the winter blizzards returned, screaming across the peaks and burying the world in ice, they couldn't touch her. Deep inside the mountain, surrounded by the quiet hum of the earth, Nora Hayes was finally home.